Man, guys, I've been procrastinating on this one all day, so hopefully this ends up working out. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of List Doctor, where I, Joshua Joshi Howard, go over lists that you guys submit and make some suggestions on how I think I could make them a little bit better. To start off with, this is a bit of a trial episode, so if this is something you guys like, if this is something you guys are interested in, make sure you let me know down in the comments so I can continue doing it. Right now, it is mostly open to people who have memberships, so if you already have a membership, if you're already part of the Discord, make sure you come in and join. The other thing I will say is it is currently limited to Astra Militarum lists because I do not feel like I can give good enough advice about lists that are not in the guard simply because I don't know them as well. Today we're going to be going over 3 lists submitted by people who are already members, but if you want to make sure that you can get your list into a future episode, make sure you become a member first. I will be prioritizing those lists, and if you are still interested, go ahead and join the Discord as well. The password remains Kazarkin, so if you send that to me on Reddit or on Discord, I will send you a link to the Discord so you can join. If you want to learn more about what lists are currently having success in the meta, and there's a lot of interesting ones right now, make sure you check out the links in the description. There is one there for the Ko-fi page where you can go ahead and find a database where I'm keeping track of all of the different lists that people are doing well with at large events, as well as the matchups that they're going through, so you can get some kind of idea on where they might have some strengths and weaknesses. And thank you again to all of the members who have contributed to this channel. It means a lot to me every single time I see a new one pop up, so thanks to everybody who has become a member and is continuing to support the channel. So the first list that I took a look at was one that was submitted by member Xeph, and I hope that's right. I'm assuming it's a Z sound, but either way, apologies to anyone if I get your names wrong. And I will say, before I even start going over this list, the lists you guys submitted were actually pretty good. It was kind of hard for me to look at these and come up with ways that I can really change them in ways that I think would make them even stronger. But let's take a look at the list as it has been presented. Xeph puts in Lord Solar Leontis, a platoon command squad, a tank commander with Grand Strategist and Demo Cannon, Ursula Creed, 4 units of 10 Catachan, 3 Chimeras with Flamers, 1 Basilisk with a Flamer, 1 unit of 3 Bulgrin, 2 Lehman Russ Demolishers with Lascannon and Multi-Meltas, and then 2 Rogel Dorns with Meltaguns. Honestly, looking at this list, I think it's hard to say that this list would not be decent, right? It has everything you really need in a current guard list to have decent chances at a tournament. It might not be winning the whole event, but you're not going to be pressed because your list is bad. It's going to be the kind of list that you bring where it might struggle into a couple of matchups, but more than anything, it's a list that gives you options to do just about anything that you want. Xeph did mention that this is supposed to be an armored and mechanized infantry list, and it definitely hits all of those. It is a very reasonable list, but let's go ahead and take a small look at what kind of changes I would consider making. Honestly, I really like the shell of this whole list. It passes the damage test, the War Dogs test. If you're interested, I will put a link somewhere on screen. And it has lots of OC that you can continuously deny your opponents from scoring on their natural objective. The main thing that sticks out to me, though, is I'm not really sure that 1 unit of 3 Bulgrin is going to have a critical mass to do a whole lot of anything. And there's a lot of really low AP shooting in the army that we'd like to bump up, specifically on the Rogodorns and on the Chimeras. So let's go ahead and take a look at what changes I would consider making to this list before I would run it at an event. So the main changes I would look to be doing with this is turning one of the Lehman Russ Demolishers to an Exterminator. When Xeph submitted this list, Xeph mentioned that the Demolishers were there to just go in, get stuck in. You don't really mind if they're in combat. And it's kind of funny to me that I'm suggesting the Exterminator go back in, especially after Xeph had said that they had had a Hellhound, or excuse me, that they had had an Exterminator in the list beforehand. The other major change that I would make is I would be dropping the unit of 3 Bulgrin simply because I don't think it hits a critical mass. It doesn't do a lot for the army. It's a durable action doer, sure, but you can also do the same thing with a Hellhound. The biggest advantage that we have with this version of the list than the one that Xeph was bringing before is, yes, we have 1 fewer Demolisher, but the Exterminator can do a similar job. It's not as effective as a Demolisher in close combat, but it is nearly as effective because it is able to shoot its main gun into the combat because it doesn't have blast. The other major thing is you now have these 2 awesome support pieces in the Hellhound and the Exterminator who, between Fields of Fire, Withering Hell from the Exterminator, and flush them out from the Hellhound, you're now getting effective +3 AP on all of your weapons across the board. This turns your Rogue Doran AP2 into functionally AP5 if you really need it, though generally you only need to get it to AP3 in order to put things on invul saves. In order to lean into this a little bit further, I'm going to generally recommend that you change the flamers on the Chimeras to heavy bolters if you can. The big reason for this is if you already have a Hellhound and 2 Rogue Dorans, you have a lot of Overwatch targets in your list already, that having extra flamers on your Chimeras to be extra Overwatch threats doesn't add a whole lot of extra value to the list. However, if we give them the ability to have lethal hits against monsters and vehicles, suddenly those bolters, when combined with Hellhounds and Exterminators, suddenly become AP3 heavy bolters, which is a massive threat to pretty much anything on the table. At this point, the concept of screen is still in effect, especially based on the concepts that Xeph put in the context they put into their list. Now, instead of just having the Demolishers as your second wave, you have a Hellhound and you have the Exterminator and the Demolisher that can all serve in the second wave of screens, which will allow your Rogue Dorans to just shoot for free pretty much across the entire board. Couple of small recommendations in terms of gameplay. I would generally recommend putting one of these Chimera with Catachan in strategic reserve, simply so that you have access to bring them out on the map a little bit further up on the board instead of just forcing them to move up relatively early on, and it gives you a little bit better opportunities to do secondaries on turns 2 and 3. If I were to continue looking at this, the main change that I would consider making even further, depending on how you're currently playing in your at-home games or any tournaments that you potentially are going to, is whether or not the Basilisk is important in your local meta. If you're running into a lot of things like World Eaters or Oryx or Custodies, where the -2 move, advance, and charge comes into effect, that is very valuable. However, you already have enough screens that it might not be the biggest value add, and instead you could consider adding something like Gaunt's Ghost in its place in order to help out with some of the scoring across the board. Next, let's go ahead and talk about GeorgeLeEpic's list. And one of the first things that I thought was really funny when I was reading through the context that George added to their list was they called it a home run league. And it took me like 3 read-throughs to understand what a home run league was, because I was trying to figure out what baseball had to do with 40K until I realized that it actually was a league run at home, which makes way more sense in this context. George did talk a little bit about the factions that are included in the league, and I generally agree with the diagnosis that George had that whether or not this list does enough damage is kind of in question. It might do enough with the volume of fire from the Chimeras, but without orders, I'm not quite confident that it'll pack the punch you want, especially into an army like Necrons, where you really have to overkill things in order to make sure they're dead. So that in mind, let's go ahead and talk about George's list. He has Gaunt's Ghosts, 2 tank commanders with demo cannons, las cannons, and meltas, Ursa Creed as the Warlord, 5 units of 10-man Catachans, 1 unit of 10 infantry with a mortar, 6 Chimeras, all with bolters, 1 unit of Khazarkin, 2 Hellhounds, and 2 Exterminators. So one of the other pieces of context George gave into this is that he wants to make sure that it continues to have 6 Chimeras, and I totally respect that. It's a very cool archetype, but let's go ahead and take a look at what changes I would consider making. So honestly, this is a really subtle change to the list as well. With my primary concern being looking at this list is that it's just on the low end of damage that it's actually putting out. I would love to add just a little bit more damage into this list. And so in order to do that, I'm going to be looking at dropping the Khazarkin, downgrading Khazarkin into another unit of Catachan, so you fill every single Chimera with Catachan, and also dropping the Hellhound. This might seem odd based on what I did with Xeph's list earlier, where I added in a Hellhound in order to pump up the damage, but this time around, I really want to add in a Lemonor's Battle Tank. And the big reason for that is the Lemonor's Battle Tank is a tank that doesn't really rely on orders, similar to the Hellhound, but it does way more damage to most targets than a Hellhound is going to do. The other thing that this Battle Tank adds to the list that is desperately missing is there's not really strong rapid ingress threats. There's not really strong reserves threats that George currently has in the list. And if you don't have anything in reserve that forces your opponents to respect damage that they can't really screen out, it makes it way easier for opponent to move on the board. And adding this Lemonor's Battle Tank onto the potential reserves or putting it on the board, depending on what the situation is, depending on deployment, allows you to threaten a lot of parts of the map that you would not be able to otherwise. And it doesn't really matter that it's coming out in the movement phase, because it doesn't generally need orders. It's going to be shooting at things where it is going to be usually re-rolling against things on objectives. Ultimately, though, I think this list still makes a lot of sense as is. George put together something that is a little bit on the low edge of damage, but especially if you're playing in a lot of your at-home games, it should end up working out. You have a lot of OC, you have a lot of activations with the Chimeras, you're just right on the edge of whether or not that damage is going to be enough. So pushing into a Luminous Battle Tank, so a little bit more concentration of force, should help out quite a bit. One of the other stipulations that George has was that he doesn't have any abhumans, and he doesn't really have the interest to be adding Ogryn or Bulgrin into the list. However, if that had been an option, if you were to look to make continued changes, I would still be looking to drop the Khazarkim and instead upgrade some of the Catachan and the Chimeras to Ogryn, simply because they do a lot more damage with the bolter equivalent shots, and they put out a ton of work into Marina Necron bodies, which are fairly common in the league that George is going to be playing in. Other thing is that they have lethal hits as long as you're firing them from firing deck at vehicles and monsters, so they actually punch up a lot harder than you might expect. The last list we're going to be covering today is a list submitted by AusBox, and it includes Lord Solar Leontis, Gaunt's Ghosts, Ursula Creed, a Platoon Command Squad, a Militarum Tempestus Command Squad, 1 unit of 10 Catachan, 2 units of 6 Bulgrin, 1 unit of 10 Scions, 1 unit of 5 Scions, 1 unit of 5 Rough Riders, 1 Hellhound, 3 Leman Norse Battle Tanks, and 2 Leman Norse Exterminators. Now, I gotta admit, this list looks very familiar. It shares a lot of overlap with a list that I've been trying out that was pioneered by David Purcell at the North American Team Championships, but it substitutes out a Scion Brick, a Tank Commander, and a Hellhound for a Leontis Command Brick and 2x6 Bulgrin. David would be really sad, but this is a list kind of similar to what I was actually thinking about changing for my last GT. So ultimately, I think this list can be run pretty much as is if you were to take it to a tournament. And I think it's actually fairly similar to a player that went 4-1 at my GT named Tony Baumeier, and it should have a lot of success. However, this is List Doctor, so I would definitely spend a lot of time racking my brain about any kind of changes I would consider making to this kind of list. So honestly, like I said, it took me a while to come up with something that I thought was a further optimization than what AusBox already had. It seems like the list that he suggested is very close to a local maximum in terms of what you could do with the list without significantly rewriting it, which I don't think is the point of List Doctor. I don't want to take lists that you guys have had and just be like, yeah, just get rid of all of that, and what if you just play this other proven list instead? One of the big things about this kind of list is when you have the Bulgrin, you already have that melee threat. You already have the ability to play in the charge and fight phase, where a lot of lists kind of struggle to actually do damage and fix some of their problems if they do not have access to this. With that said, having the Bulgrin really necessitates having Lord Solar and the Command Brick, but I'm not sure what 5 Rough Riders is really adding to this list. It's fast, but it doesn't hit that hard with only 5 guys. Like, it will kill chaff, it can go do secondaries, but I'm not really worried about that when I already have the Scions and Gaunt's Ghosts, and just Ursula Creed kind of wandering around helping out with that at the same time. The only real concern I had looking at this is the order economy is not great, simply because with 2 Bulgrin and 5 Leman Russes that all like orders, they don't need orders, but they all like orders, that's a lot of units on the board that you do not necessarily have consistent orders for. You're going to have to do a lot of picking and choosing, when I don't think we need to be doing that. So the only change that I would look to make and playtest a little bit is, instead of having a 3rd Leman Russ Battle Tank, which is a very good tank, if we change that into a tank commander with the Grand Strategist enhancement. And we can pay for this by dropping the 5 Rough Riders. Then we also put a Death Mask on the Platoon Command Squad or the Militarum Tempestus Command Squad. It doesn't really matter. We just have 10 extra points lying around, and so that's the only thing we can really do with just 10 points. But what this does, but now instead of having 7 units that are asking for Lord Solar's orders, we still have the same amount asking for Lord Solar orders, but we now have an alternative where Lord Solar can order the Tank Commander can order 2 of the tanks, and suddenly you aren't as limited in having the options to try and maximize your damage across the board. Like I said before, though, this list looks pretty darn refined. If I was trying to further optimize this, the only real place where I would even consider making changes is dropping the Platoon Command Squad and the Catachan and just being more aggressive with Lord Solar in general. You already have Ursula Creed who can stand on the backfield. You have tools that you can use in order to get the Fields of Fire and the Suppression Fire in order to try and farm CP. That's the only place I would even consider trying to make further changes without significant playtests. So with all that said, that's the first episode of List Doctor here at Joshi40K. Hopefully you guys have found this useful and thinking a little bit more about the list that you guys are actually bringing. Like I said, you guys are bringing some pretty darn good lists already. It's kind of hard to make good changes. I was honestly expecting people to be submitting worse lists where it's like, oh yeah, cut this, cut that, cut that. We're going to make all of these changes all over the place. But no, you guys seem to have done a pretty good job already. If you're interested in getting your list into future episodes of List Doctor, like I said, members will have first priority, but make sure you join the Discord. A reminder, the password is Kazerkin. Send it to me on Reddit or Discord, and I will send you an invite to our server. But for now, hope this has been useful. We'll see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.